Welcome back to the Morning Docket here at Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. After 7.5 hours of deliberations, the jury has decided the fate for the confessed Parkland school shooter. Will he spend the rest of his life in prison or be sentenced to death? That is the question, and that verdict will be read today at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We have just gotten the word, and we are going to bring it to you live. This is just a sampling, right, Rich, of what we've seen from the prosecution and the defense. I don't know. With a verdict coming back after 7.5 hours, a part of me says maybe they were quickly deciding death. On the other hand, I'm also thinking that, you know, if you have this difficult question, even despite how strong the prosecution's case was, of making a determination about ending someone's life, would it have required more time to deliberate? I don't know. What do you think?
I can't tell from the amount of time it's taken. I mean, this case to me comes down to a fundamental philosophical question. This is the most horrific crime you can imagine, and it was perpetrated with a degree of premeditation that's startling. I mean, he trained for it, he dreamed of it, he prepared for it for months or maybe even years. So it's really the most terrible crime you can imagine, with 17 victims. And the philosophical question is, does anything mitigate that? The prosecution in this case proved all 7 of the aggravating factors up, down, and sideways. No question, every single one of those aggravating factors exists. So the question for this jury is, does anything you heard suffice for you to mitigate and to allow this person to live the rest of his life?
This wasn't always the law in Florida. This wasn't. We didn't always have unanimous jury verdicts for the death penalty.
This is a much harder path to a death penalty being imposed than it used to be. And I am not a supporter of the death penalty. I've said that on this network before. But if we're going to have it, I feel better about this procedure where you do have to have a unanimous jury. They're told very specifically what you find. And you have incredible lawyers on both sides of this case who I think have done an excellent job putting on their evidence, making their arguments, putting it all out there for the jury to decide. I think the lawyers have done a great job in this case. I think the jury has done, the judge has done a good job. And just back to your point about the families for a minute, their composure and their performance on the stand in this case was remarkable. And part of why they did it was because they want this verdict, but part of why they did it was just to tell their story and to tell the story of the 17 victims.
Yeah, and that's what it comes back to, right? You know, we try to, obviously this is a trial about the fate of the defendant, but at the end of the day, it's really about the victims. And Rich, was there anything in the defense's case, a particular mitigating factor that stood out to you? I mean, again, this is a situation that was all centered upon mental health. The question was that he never got a shot at life, that perhaps this could have been avoided if someone had stepped in at some point. And I will tell you, it was a tragic story for him. No matter which way the jury comes back, it was a tragic story of what happened to Nicholas Cruz. And you see it building up year after year after year after year until ultimately 2018. So I'm curious if there was anything for the defense that stood out to you.
What stood out for me is the way the whole story played out, but in particular when his biological sister testified that he was conceived in a polluted womb, was the term she used, because he was a victim of fetal alcohol syndrome and of a mother who was using drugs and alcohol. And so before he was even born, he had a tough go of it. And then all through life. And, you know, this trial is about something much bigger than the question of whether Nicholas Cruz is going to be executed or not. Part of what the families wanted us to see are things we should be focusing on to prevent this kind of tragedy from happening again. And while we were watching this trial, Uvalde happened.
Yeah.
So these issues about, you know, were there warning signs? How can we see these kind of people sooner? How can we better help children to get through issues they may have? How can we identify them? How can we get them into the right kind of schools? And I'm not going to ignore it. What should we do about the guns that this defendant was able to obtain relatively easily and utilize to commit these horrific acts? These are incredibly important issues that are put on the table. The families wanted us to watch this trial. I don't think they want us to stop talking about these issues.
Rich, I do want to ask you something about what might be going on in the mind of Nicholas Cruz and what he hopes for this. We talked about how he hasn't made a statement to this jury in this case, but after he had pled guilty back in, I believe it was last year, it was back in October of 2021, this is the statement he made to the court. I'm going to read it right now. Again, there was no jury. This is what he said. He goes, "I'm very sorry for what I did, and I have to live with it every day. And if I were to get a second chance, I will do everything in my power to try to help others. I am doing this for you, and I do not care if you do not believe me, and I love you, and I know you don't believe me, but I have to live with this every day, and it brings me nightmares, and I can't live with myself sometimes, but I tried to push through because I know that's what you guys would want me to do." Very confusing statement. Still don't even know who he was directing it to. Based on that, does it seem to you that he believes he could be a benefit to people that he's locked away with? I'm not sure what it meant.
The only thing I made out of that statement was proof that he shouldn't be put on the witness stand in this trial, because I didn't even follow that statement when he read it or when you read it. But back up a little bit. You know, I've been torn about this trial from the beginning because this defendant wanted to be a famous school shooter. That's what the evidence showed. He admired those who had preceded him, and he wanted to be famous. And the sad fact is that this trial has only made him more famous. And if he gets the death penalty, that will make him even more famous. And part of me always said, why don't we just put this guy in a hole in prison somewhere for 40 years and never speak his name again? That would be contrary to what he was hoping to accomplish. But I was persuaded by the families who wanted us to watch the trial and, again, wanted us to learn from it and wanted us to hear the stories of the victims. And that was persuasive enough to me to say that we should be paying attention to the trial, even though it has this counterproductive effect of making famous this guy who wanted to be famous.
See, you have to respect the jury's verdict, as we do in every case. Obviously, I would love to understand what the deliberations were like over 7.5 hours, how they came to this decision. You had mentioned possibly it was one holdout. Could have very well been that. But you had said that they found for the aggravating factors, but they did find mitigation as well. I guess the question is, what's the overall message here? I've been looking online and people say, well, if you're not going to find the death penalty for someone that murdered all these children and faculty, then where would the death penalty be appropriate? I guess it's an interesting question here.
Well, as I said when we started out today, it's fundamentally a philosophical question. There's no doubt that there were aggravating factors. The jury found them for each of the victims unanimously. There's actually no doubt that there were some mitigating factors. And the philosophical question was, could anything really mitigate this horrendous of a crime? And at least one juror on this panel has said yes. It doesn't mean all of them did. And I really do feel for the victims, too. They must be so disappointed to have gone through all of this again. And all I can say to them are two things. One, I agree life in prison without opportunity for parole is a very severe punishment. And the second thing I would say is that they did the victims proud. They stood on the stand and told the stories of those 17 victims to all of us. And we all watched and we all paid attention, and they did them proud. And we're going to remember those victims, and we're going to talk about the issues that this trial raised for a long time.